Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
I just finished talking about the strict nature of type identity theory in view of the plasticity of the nature of the brain, such that what the type identity theory expects, namely law-like generalization of every mental state corresponding to some particular type of physical state. That expectation, with the possibility of law-like generalization of the mental, physical, or mental neural relation, is too much to expect given the plasticity of the brain. As I just said, that for example, I could experience a state of pain of a certain type now, which means there will be a certain kind of neural firing as its correlate. But it's not necessary that half an hour later, if I experience the same pain state, exactly the same neural pattern would occur. And this is, of course, in the case of the same person at two different times. But the same logic would apply, or could possibly apply, to the same type of mental state occurring in two different persons at a particular time. It's not necessary that corresponding to the occurrence of the same type of pain, for example, in these two persons, A and B, that the neural states corresponding to A and B will also be absolutely identical occurrence. There is possibility of variation, and in order to be sensitive to this possibility, later theorists who became critical of type identity theory proposed a more relaxed version of the identity theory, which is known as the token identity theory. This difference between type identity theory and token identity theory within the general framework of physicalism or physicalist monism can be explicated now by reference to an analysis of the distinction between type and token. The analysis could be provided with the help of an example like this. Suppose there is a particular book, let's say the Old Bible. Now, if somebody has 10 different copies of the same Old Bible, then what's the difference between the Bible and the various copies, distinct individual copies of the Bible? Well, the difference is that the distinct 10 copies of the Bible are 10 tokens of the same Bible type, Old Bible type. Similarly, we can talk about, let's say, 5 different dogs, say 5 different Alsatian dogs. These 5 different dogs are 5 different tokens of the same type, the type called the Alsatian dog. Now, this notion of a token is applied to the identity theory in place of type, the resulting token identity theory has this sort of a character. Namely, what it says as a theoretical statement, what it says is this, that for every mental token, that means for every token mental state of a certain type, whether it is pain type or it is some sort of emotion type or some sort of feeling type, for each mental token of that particular type, there will be some neural or physical state or other. It would be identical to some neural or physical state or other. And that's how the physicality or physical nature of the state is established or claimed. It's not necessary that different, let's say, pain tokens occurring in 3 different persons will have one and the same type of neural state. In this way, at least the fact that the brain is a plastic system, the plasticity of the brain feature will not be ignored in proposing the identity between a mental state and a neural or physical state. On the other hand, the advantage of a token identity theory is this, that imagine there is a creature which is a creature of a very non-standard biological constitution than, say, a human biological constitution. And it's quite possible that that creature with non-human biological constitution experiences the kind of pain that we experience. And if physicalism is to be true, if identity physicalism is to be true, then we would have to say that any token pain state occurring in any member of that creature, non-human creature with a non-human biology, will have some sort of a physical state, physical or biological state, with which that token mental state is identified. Now that physical or biological state obviously would be very different in nature than human biological or neural state. If that possibility is to be granted, which of course one has to grant because it is quite conceivable, then one can't stick to the earlier very strict type identity theory, because in that theory, to be a mental state of a certain type, a pain type or whatever, is to be identical with a neural state of a certain type, and that neural state of a certain type is fixed by the human biological system. It is fixed in terms of what is instantiated in the human biological case, in the human neural case. And in a way that restrains the possibility of proposing an identity theory, identity physicalist theory, beyond the human range, beyond the range of the human species. Philosophically speaking, that sort of restraint, that sort of boundary condition is conceptually conservative, because the conceivability of the occurrence of a pain state like the one we experience, the conceivability of its occurring in some other kind of creature, in some other kind of conscious creature of non-biological, non-human, sorry, not non-biological, but non-human biological constitution should not be ruled out. Now, token identity physicalism is, of course, better than the type identity physicalism as a theory of mind-brain identity, but it is not that token identity physicalism is the last word in it. It is not that if you are going to prefer a physicalist position over a dualist or immaterialist Cartesian position, if, in other words, physicalism or physicalist monism is the best alternative to take, given the dismal experiences about problems regarding mental causation, then it doesn't mean that we stop at the level of token identity theory. Why is that the reason? I mean, why further possibilities would not arise in somewhat of a critique of even token identity theory? That is because of a question which goes like this. The question is this. I mean, it is seen in token identity theory that, for example, all token pains which are either experienced by one person or experienced by different persons, all these different pain tokens do not have to exemplify exactly the same type of brain state. That's the message, essential message of the token identity theory or of the token identity view. Then the question is, if that's the case, the question is, and this is a very important question in making another further move, a further theoretical move, probably a move of advancement, theoretical advancement. So the crucial question is, what is it that all of these tokens have in common that makes them tokens of the same mental type? It's a very natural question to raise. There are n number of token mental states of a certain type, and they have a commonality. They are tokens of the same type in virtue of there being something common, some common property. Exactly the way in the Bible example that I gave just a while ago, or in the dog example that I gave, you can see quite easily that the 10 tokens of the old Bible are tokens of the same type, the old Bible type. In virtue of what? What is that common feature? Well, each token shares that feature. Each token counts as one copy of the same old Bible. So it's counting, each token counting as a Bible is, as it were, a role that each token has, each token plays. in being a token of a particular type. Similarly, the 5 dogs are the 5 tokens of the same dog type because they have the common property of behaving in the way a dog behaves, a dog of that particular type, say Alsatian or whatever. Okay? So in the case of brain token states, in the case of mental token states, we can say the same thing. If each pain token is identical with some brain state token or some token brain state, then the question is what these token brain states have that makes them mental states of a certain type, say pain type. The answer to that question is, let me repeat it, what token brain states have that makes them mental states is a certain type of function in the overall behavior of the organism. That means these different brain tokens, they function in a common way, and that function is reflected in the overall behavior of the organism which experiences pain. That means if a person A has that pain token which corresponds to or which is identical with a particular brain token, and person B has that pain token occurring in him which is identical with a particular brain state, token brain state occurring in him, what is common between these two token brain states is that they function in the same way in the overall behavior of the person, the organism which has pain. And that function, of course, is how, for example, pain behavior is expressed by both these organisms. So it is the notion of function, common function, that underlies the unity of tokens of a certain type, the common property that the tokens share. And therefore, this idea of function became the basis of another kind of theory following token identity theory. And this other kind of theory is, of course, known as functionalism, derived from the very concept of function, concept of a function. And how is this concept of a function defined? It is, of course, a mathematical concept. Here, the concept of a function is defined in terms of a causal relation of the given state to, on the one hand, external stimuli, and then to other mental states that occur in that organism, and further to external behavioral manifestation. What I'm saying in talking about this new theory called functionalism is that when it comes to defining a state as a mental state, it's not necessary that your definition has to rely on what that mental state is constituted of. For example, in the case of physicalism, both type physicalism and token physicalism, type identity physicalism and token identity physicalism, the concern in defining a mental state is that of finding out what constitutes that mental state, the very inner constitution of the mental state. And the answer in both these versions of the identity theory is that it is a certain kind of neurophysiological state. The mental state is neurophysiologically constituted. The ontology of the mental state is the ontology of a neurophysiological state. So the issue of constitution of the mental state is decisive of the very nature of the mental state. Now, what happens because of this this emphasis on the constitution of the mental state, the neurophysiological constitution of the mental state, is precisely that it constrains the possibility of there being mental states by a certain kind of requirement, which is that the system must have a certain kind of biology, a certain kind of neurophysiology. Only then any member of that organism, any member of that biological system can instantiate a mental state. Because any given mental state, any occurrent mental state has to be identical with some neurophysiological state, whether standard or non-standard, but nonetheless some neurophysiological state. And this constraint, this sort of biological constraint, as I said a little while ago, is philosophically conservative, because someone might say, given the nature of philosophy, which indulges very freely on what is conceivable, they would say, it's quite conceivable that similar mental states that we experience, we humans experience, or we biologically constituted beings experience, could possibly occur in other systems which do not have any kind of biological constitution, whether standard human type or very non-standard non-human type. And this extension of the possibility of mentality beyond the biological category, if this extension, consideration of this extension is permitted by the very philosophical possibility of conceivability, then physicalism of the identity variety is not going to be very much acceptable. I mean, it may be subject to a critique, and even though the critique is a fairly radical critique. One such critique is known as Specieschauvinism or neural chauvinism, better Specieschauvinism. What it means is that to the extent that the identity theory is a physicalist program, a physicalist program of a very specific kind because of its constraint on biology, that mentality can be realized only in a biological system. To that extent, the claim being made is that mental states are possible only for a certain kind of species, say the human species because of its biological constitution, and maybe other non-human species which have biological constitution, human-like or different type, nonetheless biological constitution. So it is constrained by or limited to certain species. This is Specieschauvinism, and in saying, I mean, this is of course a critical remark, because chauvinism is a pejorative connotation. The rhetorical implication is that your theory should not be chauvinistic in regard to any particular species. Your theory should have the kind of philosophical liberalism that allows the possibility of mentality being realized by other systems other than biological, or systems other than those which are biological or biological species. Functionalism now is quite intelligently and quite imaginatively is above this criticism. In fact, it is the functionalist theorist who raises this criticism of Specieschauvinism, because for the first time in the history of thought where this debate is going on, the functionalist theorists conceptualized mentality in non-constitutive terms. What I mean by that is that it conceptualized mentality in functional terms, and functional terms are not terms of constitution. What I mean by that could be explained with the help of some ordinary example. Let's say a clock. Now, what is a clock? A clock is a functional system in the sense that it functions in a certain way in order to give time, and it has that, if you like, time-giving function. And it is one thing that clocks are made of certain kind of material, steel or plastic or whatever. That means the constitution of the clock, the hardware in which the clock is made, is one thing. Okay. But the function that any clock performs is quite another thing, and insofar as any clock of any make, whether made of plastic or of steel or even of wood, if it functions as a clock, that is a time-giving function, then that function is common to all these different clock tokens which have different makes in different hardware or different material constitution. In that case, what is relevant is the functional property of the clock. The making property of the clock, the constitution of the clock, is not quite relevant. And these functionalist philosophers thought that we should conceptualize the nature of mentality in that abstract way. Abstract in the sense that the very notion of a function is an abstract notion. Abstract in relation to what is concrete. For example, the concrete clock is concrete because of its constitution, because of its make in a particular material. But the function that it performs, that the concrete clock performs, is purely abstract. Okay? In that sense, function is an abstract notion. What if we conceptualize mental states in the way we conceptualize things like clocks? That means in functional terms, just as we conceptualize clocks in functional terms, or knives in functional terms, because anything is a knife if it performs the functional role of cutting objects. So it could be a paper knife, it could be a steel knife, it could be a plastic knife. So the constitution of the knife, the material in which the knife is made is one thing, but the performance, the function that it performs, the functional role that it plays is quite another thing. So go for the functional role identification or conceptualization of mental states. That's the recommendation. Think of mental states in this abstract way, in abstract functionalist terms. Withdraw yourself from that other paradigm which both the physicalist and the Cartesian dualist had in common. What is that paradigm? That paradigm is that mentality is defined in terms of what it is constituted of. In the case of Cartesian dualism, it was non-physical. A mind is a non-physical substance. That means the very constitution of the mind is immaterial or non-physical. In the case of physicalism, clearly, or identity theory, a mental state is a neural state. That means it is neurophysiologically constituted. It has a biological constitution. Okay? That is the paradigm, call it the paradigm of constitution. And the functionalist is recommending that you withdraw your theoretical mind from that paradigm of constitution. You channelize your theoretical attention to the completely different paradigm, which is that of functionality of a particular state. Okay. Now, so let's apply the functionalist conceptualization of mental states. Let's apply this conceptualization to a particular example of a mental state. Let's say a pain. We have been talking about pain as an example of a mental state. So in the Cartesian theory, dualistic theory, if a pain occurs, or if a thought occurs, or if an emotion occurs, or if a belief occurs, whatever the mental state is, then something non-physical occurs. Some real state occurs, but it's non-physically real. In the case of identity theory, when a mental state occurs, what occurs in reality is a physical state, namely a neurophysiological state, a brain state. Okay. And so that is how the mental state is characterized in both these theories. But there's something that the functionalist theorist is trying to remind juncture, at this juncture. And what it tries to remind has to do with another theory which has been discredited long ago as a theory of mind, and that's behaviorism. What is behaviorism? Behaviorism is a psychological theory according to which a mental state is to be read as a behavioral state. And of course, the psychological motivation for a behaviorist theory was a kind of scientism, because prior to behaviorism, what had prevailed was a kind of introspectionism, in which the idea was that something is a mental state insofar as it is a state that can be accessed only by introspection. So a mental state becomes, by definition, an introspectable state, introspectable inner state. And of course, what goes with introspection of inner states is that introspective access to that inner state is definitionally a private access. And this privacy attached to the mental state rules out the possibility of a scientific study of mentality. So the behaviorist who has been scientifically inclined, in a way, rejected introspectionist account of the mind by saying it is pointless to theorize mental states in introspectionist terms, because it would end up privatizing and thereby mystifying what is mental. And a scientific objective study of mentality should resort to what is behaviorally manifested by the so-called minded or mentally endowed organism. Now, behavioral manifestation is in a way a functional notion, because we would say that if somebody behaves in a certain way, we explain the behavior as the typical way that person or that organism functions. That means the behavior is the representation of a certain kind of function. In other words, the individual who behaves in a certain way is, as it were, a functional system. Under certain circumstances, given certain stimuli, there is this sort of behavioral response, this sort of functional output. So these functionalist philosophers who came after, who were critiques of the physicalist position, the identity physicalist position, they drew this notion of function from behaviorism, but they were themselves far from being behaviorists. They were not behaviorists, they were quite different. Now, what is the difference between that discredited theory of behaviorism and this very promising theory of functionalism with respect to mentality or mental states? Well, the big difference is this. In the case of behaviorism, there was a very narrow two-term framework of explanation. That is to say, there is a stimulus that the human organism or this biological system receives from the environment, and then correspondingly there is a behavioral output behavioral response. So it is this stimulus input and behavioral output. That's the relationship, this correlation. Studying this correlation is all that there is to studying mentality. Okay. In a way, this is far too narrow, or one could say far too restrictive, because the question of what there is between the stimulus on the one hand and the response on the other hand, environmental stimulus on the one hand, behavioral response on the other hand, what there might be between the stimulus and the response, that question was completely bypassed, perhaps deliberately bypassed, because it's a completely, as it were, invisible domain. You cannot figure out what could there be, and therefore it's pointless to speculate. Just treat it as some kind of a black box. Now, functionalism did not view it that way at all. That means the explanation given in terms of merely these two terms, environmental response and environmental stimulus and behavioral response, was too poor as an explanatory theory. So they were in agreement with what later on became known as Cognitivism, as a reaction against behaviorism. Cognitivism is the view according to which between the environmental stimulus and the behavioral response, there is the cognitive domain, the domain of cognition, the inner domain. Okay. Some sort of cognitive processing occurs. And of course, that cognitive processing takes place in the complicated, complex network of brain states. So the brain is a kind of network, or a kind of network in which you can read a certain kind of cognitive architecture. And of course, it is a very, very speculative task to draw out this cognitive architecture that has its place in this intermediate region between the environmental stimulus and any particular behavioral response. Now, this idea of cognitivism has been adopted by functionalism in order to say this. Let's say, just to talk about an example, let's say there is a particular environmental stimulus, say the perception of rainfall outside. The human organism is perceiving, let's say, through the window from the house that rain is pouring. And so the environmental stimulus is rainfall, which is perceived, and then this perceptual registration of a particular kind of environmental stimulus, which is rainfall, is processed in the brain. Some kind of complicated internal processing occurs in the brain as a result of this environmental stimulus. And Then in the language of cognitivism, what occurs in this processing is described as certain kind of information processing. Some information is processed, which means a certain kind of cognitive state occurs, a certain kind of well-formed, more or less well-formed cognitive state occurs. And in ordinary folk psychological language, this more or less well-defined cognitive state is called the occurrence of a belief. In other words, this human organism, having received that particular environmental stimulus of rainfall through its perceptual modality, and having processed that informational intake, it comes to form the belief, the cognitive state of believing that it is raining outside. I mean, that's the way, in folk psychological terms, this cognitivist phenomenon would be described. Okay. Now, because this cognitive state of belief, namely the belief that it is raining outside, arises, this belief doesn't sit idle there in that within that cognitive architecture, in that inner domain, because there are other cognitive states, other subsidiary and related cognitive states also which occur, either occur or which are already there in some sort of implicit, unconscious or subconscious way. Now, in this case, to continue the example that we are discussing, namely the perception of the rainfall and the formation of the belief that it is raining outside, if that is the central cognitive state, information processing state, another subsidiary state with which this particular state is related, and related in a very relevant sense, would be, for example, a desire state, another cognitive state, which is a desire state, namely the desire to remain, let's say, dry. And there could be other cognitive states, underlying conscious or subconscious or unconscious cognitive states, like a state of memory. For example, remembering that that there is a way to protect yourself against the rain if you want to remain dry, if you don't want to get wet. So what has happened? In this inner domain of cognitive architecture, three cognitive states are in place. One is the belief that it is raining, the other is the desire to remain wet in case you have to walk outside, and the third one is the memory that in the past, by taking an umbrella while walking outside in the rain, you were able to protect yourself against getting wet. Now, this belief that it is raining outside, combined with that desire to remain dry, and that memory that in the past you were able to remain dry while walking in the rain by the use of an umbrella, this combination of the belief state with the desire state and the memory state is able to play a particular functional role, causal role. What that means is that given this belief, along with this desire and memory, you will behave in a certain way. For example, you have to go out in that rain. Because of that belief and that desire and that memory, your behavior will be the behavior of taking an umbrella out, opening it, and then walking with the umbrella over your head, placed over your head. Okay? That is the behavioral manifestation. So what has happened? Three things are there. Environmental stimulus, rainfall, being perceptually registered, that's the input. Then there are inner states which are caused by this input, namely that belief, that desire, and that memory. And these three inner states, mainly the belief state, along with the other two inner states, desire and memory, will cause the human organism to behave in a certain way, namely taking out an umbrella while walking outside. So that's the behavioral output, the third factor. So the three factors are environmental input, inner states, and behavioral output. All these three are causally connected. Of course, in this way, from the environmental input towards the causation of inner states, which in turn plays a causal functional role in determining the way you behave, the way you act. So now the question is, which one is an example of a belief, of a mental state in this whole case? Obviously, a mental state is an inner state. So the belief state that I am talking about, along with the other inner states like desire and memory, these are instances of mental states. Now the further question is, what makes any of these states a mental state? A belief state, a desire state, a memory state. Each of these is, of course, called a mental state, named a mental state. But naming is not the question. Calling it a mental state is not the question. The question is, what makes it a mental state? Now, before I give the functionalist answer to this question, I should go back to how this question would be answered by other theorists, previous theorists. For example, how a Cartesian dualist would answer this question. The Cartesian dualist would say, these inner states, beliefs, desires, and memories, they are immaterial, non-physical states. They are states or events that occur not in space, because they don't have any extension. That's the immaterialist view. Now, the identity physicalist would say, if it's being a mental state, the belief state, the desire state, the memory state is a matter of its being a state of the brain, a neural state. That's how the answer would be given. And in both these answers, even though the two theories are, Cartesian dualism and physicalism are diametrically opposed to one another in terms of ontology, the pattern of the answer is common. There is a common pattern of answer, which is that you identify the state as a mental state in terms of what it is made up of, immaterially made up or materially made up. Functionalism is different from both in this regard, that what the mental state is made up of is the wrong kind of question is the wrong kind of question to raise, because what really matters is how these states function in the overall economy, behavioral economy of the person. What is the functional role that these states play? If you can describe the functional role of any of these states, then that would be the way to identify it as a mental state. So if we take the case of the belief state, the answer would be that a belief state is a mental state because of the functional role that this belief plays in relation to environmental input or perceptual intake, and in relation to other mental states like desires and memories within the inner domain, cognitive domain, and finally in relation to what sort of behavioral manifestation results, causally results from having this inner state. So the entire description of the belief state as a mental state is given in purely functional terms. Okay? And that's how the new theory changes the paradigm entirely by claiming that to be a mental state is to be a functional state, which means the state is a mental state if it is defined in functional terms, then the possibility of there being mental states in systems other than biological systems, in completely different and even purely mechanical systems, the possibility of mentality in such systems cannot be ruled out. And that's a very significant claim. So this is the point at which I shall take a break. Thank you.